Now, my take on carbohydrates, particularly glucose and fructose, if they're so good for us, why does the body do absolutely everything in its capacity to get it out of the bloodstream? Low carb has got a clear scientific role in the management of diabetes. And if you've got diabetes and you want to eat sugar and ice cream, you're going to be making an informed decision to be an idiot. The biggest functioning organ in the body is the glycocalyx. It's not the skin. And when you spike your blood glucose, you damage the glycocalyx. Your Maillard reaction kicks in. You are toasting your brain, your kidneys, your eyes. If you eat sugar, eat fructose, you are going to be hungry all of the time. There's also going to be an alcohol pathway which is going to be making us lethargic, tired, less motivated. Have we noticed this in society? Yes, we've got fatter, sicker, lazier. We've upped the glucose, we've upped the damage, we upped the fructose, we upped the particles which are causing more damage, and then we add in the seed oils which are inflammatory. Bang, we've got the perfect storm. We've got a description of modern disease.
Gary, somebody following a conventional dietary strategy, they consume a meal high in carbohydrates, as we're told to do. Let's take us through the physiology of what happens in the body acutely after that.
First of all, I'll take you to task. You know I will, because I'll actually call what you're calling a conventional lifestyle diet, I'll call that unconventional. Because historically, what people have, by dietary guidelines in the last 50, 100 years is so far away from our evolutionary diet. So I think we've actually been on a dietary nutrition experiment for 100 years, definitely 50 years. So I've disagreed with you right from the start. So if you're talking about a standard American, a standard Australian, what's called the SAD diet, then I think that's what you're presuming to be the conventional one, based around the food pyramid and the My Plate.
Exactly, and I totally agree with what you said up till this point. When I say conventional, I'm talking about what dietitians are recommending to the population as a whole these days.
Oh yes, I do understand that, but I thought I'd be controversial right from the word go. Well, not controversial, just I think we're a social experiment that's failing, and at some point in time you're driving up the highway against the traffic and you'll realise it's going to be a disaster, and that's what we've been doing for 50 years, 100 years. Anyway, the standard diet, which has been, recommendations are being literally pushed down our throats, like the food pyramid, having a diet which is 50 to 60% carbohydrate. If you have that, then there are essentially going to be four components to it. There's going to be carbohydrate, there's going to be protein, there's going to be fat, and there's going to be micronutrients in the form of vitamins and minerals. The standard diet, and taking the first thing, the micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, the modern diet, the current conventional diet, is actually going to be relatively lower in those than it has been, partly because of what food, when you ultra-process food, you lose those, and partly because our foods are depleted in some of those vitamins and minerals because of modern agricultural practice. Our diet, from a nutritional aspect, needs to have essential proteins and essential fats. And if you get that in the standard diet, good. But you need to be a complete set of essential fats and a complete set of essential proteins and fats. And the problem is that needs to be an animal-based diet rather than a plant-based diet. A plant-based diet will be incomplete in essential fats and incomplete in essential proteins. So let's come to the carbohydrate component. And carbohydrates are either glucose or fructose or combinations of it. You may have some non-digestible carbohydrate in the form of fibres, but from a biochemical aspect, which gets into our system, it's glucose and fructose. What we absorb into our bloodstream is glucose and fructose. We don't absorb the non-digestible carbohydrate. By definition, it's non-digestible. It's digestible if you're a cow or an ape, because we've got fermenting systems in the foregut or the hindgut for those animals. So glucose and fructose, as it turns out, are the carbohydrates that we absorb, and there is no biochemical pathway in the body that requires us to have carbohydrate, to ingest it. We don't actually need the very small amount of glucose that we require can be generated from the breakdown of fat or the breakdown of proteins. So essentially, carbohydrate in a diet is non-essential. That's it. It's just non-essential. Yet we've got food guidelines that say it should be 50 or 60%. Our evolutionary diet was depleted of carbohydrate for the vast majority of the time. We can come back to that. So if you eat 50 or 60% of glucose and sugars in your diet, when you eat that, there are a few things that happen. First of all, when it hits your mouth, there's a breakdown, an enzyme called amylase, and that's secreted in the mouth and immediately starts breaking down the carbohydrates and the glucose chains. So, and you can test that by having a bit of bread and you put it in your mouth and it's bland. But if you hold it in your mouth for 30 seconds, a minute, it gets soggy, and just chew it there. But the amylase will break the complex glucose bonds up, and you'll just break glucose. And after 30 seconds or so, I haven't done it for years, it'll start to taste a little bit sweet. So that's the very first thing. Carbohydrate starts getting broken down in our gut when it hits the mouth. Now, my take on carbohydrates, particularly glucose and fructose, if they're so good for us, so healthy for us, why does the body do absolutely everything in its capacity to get it out of the bloodstream? And we'll go through that, but essentially, take the flip side of glucose, say, look at the other side of the coin, say, actually, is carbohydrate, is glucose harmful to us? Because the body doesn't like it. It may use it as a fuel, but it actually doesn't want it in the bloodstream. And we got proof of that. And that's why I've done a talk with called Carbohydrate, the Dose is the Poison. I did that talk through COVID as my mental stimulation to actually say, if we're going to demonize carbohydrate, let's look at what is the toxic dose. And I came up ultimately with a dose of 4 grams starts to having a negative impact on the system. That's the definition of toxicity, when something has a negative impact. And 4 grams is 1 teaspoon. It's 1/5 of a slice of bread. What is it? It's only 50 mils of Coca-Cola. It's a mouthful of Coca-Cola. Now, how did I come to that conclusion? So, carbohydrates are non-essential in our biochemical pathways for survival and energy and life itself. They're seasonally available, so we don't have them vast majority of time. We do in modern society because of food transport and food mileage and storage and packaging and processing. If we look just at glucose, it gets broken down in the mouth, broken down in the gut, absorbed into the gastrointestinal tract, goes up the hepatic into the liver, and then is pretty well metabolized by the liver. Some of it goes out into the bloodstream. But its primary metabolism there, a small amount of it's turned into glycogen. Glycogen is our storage of glucose in our muscles and our liver for short-term activity. That's for our fight or flight reflex. You just need a bolus of energy in the muscles to get us out of trouble. The pancreas, which is an organ sitting right next to the liver, when the blood glucose goes up a little bit, the pancreas will secrete insulin. And insulin will push that glucose into the tissues and store it as fat. And it will do that almost instantaneously. Insulin, is a fat storage hormone, but it's also a tumor hormone. It's the biggest promoter of cancers above any other hormone. If your insulin levels go up, you've got more likely to get cancer. Those people with diabetes who have high insulin levels have higher rates of cancer. If you are insulin resistant and your insulin levels go up, you have higher rates of cancer. It's well and truly associated, but biochemically, it's a stimulator of cancer. Again, that's one of my cancer talks on YouTube. Another thing is insulin is an inflammation hormone, so it will in fact make inflammation worse. And there's been good studies out of China related to arthritis of the knee. If your insulin levels go up, inflammation in the knee goes up. If you have reduced insulin levels, inflammation in the knee goes down. Very nice, neat biochemical studies. So when you eat glucose, it goes into the liver, the body secretes insulin, has a primary effect there of actually getting stored and taken out of the bloodstream. It's common to see, historically people will have a high carb meal, and they'll go, and about an hour, then their blood glucose goes up. An hour or two later, they'll go, exhausted, and they're hungry again for more carbs. And that's actually an insulin effect, because the body's gone into extreme efforts to actually, if you've got a good functioning pancreas and a good metabolic health, your blood glucose goes up, insulin is secreted, drives it down, and there's a bit of an overshoot. So you start having a hypo leading a lower blood glucose, and that will in fact drive hunger. And you'll listen to people with diabetes or insulin resistance, or those who are carb loaded, who'll be on this cycle of think, I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm hungry, I'm tired. But it's really almost a reflection of their insulin levels going up and down. And therefore those people, and the vast majority of people on the planet, are hungry and eating 8 meals a day. Have something with the moment you wake up, then you have breakfast, then you have morning tea, then you have lunch, and then you have afternoon tea, then you have something after school or before dinner, then you have dinner, and then you have supper, and you have a little snack before you go to bed. I've lost count of them. But our bodies have lost the ability to actually even fast for 2 hours, let alone fast for 6 hours or 12 hours or 24 hours, which is the way we evolved. So that's insulin going up and down and yo-yoing. Glucose, when it hits the bloodstream, is actually quite damaging to the surface layer of arteries called the glycocalyx. The biggest functioning organ in the body is the glycocalyx. It's not the skin. On most trivia nights you go to, what's the biggest organ in the body? And the answer is skin for the trivia night. But the glycocalyx is a living organ because it produces nitric oxide in particular, and it's actually moving blood through our blood vessels. And the glycocalyx produces nitric oxide, which opens up the blood vessels in front, so the little red, or particularly the blood cells, can get through the very small capillaries in our bloodstream. If you give it a glucose load, and it's been experimented as low as 40 grams, so 10 teaspoons of sugar, hitting the system, the glycocalyx is damaged. The glycocalyx grows back very quickly, over 4 to 6 hours. But those people with diabetes, when it's being studied, have glycocalyx layers which are 50%, 70% thinner than those people who don't have diabetes. The analogy of that is that if your glycocalyx layer is very thin, it's more likely to have damage, it's more likely to have holes in it, they're more likely for things to leak out. It's the same as the leaky gut syndrome. People have an awareness of that. We've been talked about that if you've got more leaks, more holes in your gut lining, more permeability, then there are inflammatory proteins, inflammatory materials, oxalates, a lot of things from the plants can get into the bloodstream. So it's the same as a gut permeability problem, but it's actually a vascular permeability. And the thing which does that damage more than anything is glucose. Good old simple glucose damages our arterial walls more than anything. So that's another effect of glucose. The other thing we talked about, I know in the last talk, was about the Maillard reaction of glucose.
We did, but let's get back into it.
Yeah, but I think it's such an easy way to understand it, because the Maillard reaction is a cooking term, and when you actually cook something, it goes brown. So you can go down to the local bakery and you can see all the brown pastries, the breads, the pastries, donuts, cakes. They've all got this little brown layer on it. And that's because glucose combines with protein under the effect of heat, and that's called a caramelization. It's a cooking term, gives the browning. Exactly the same thing happens when your blood glucose spikes. Blood glucose spikes up to here. Tissue glucose, because it goes across into the tissues. It's not quite the same as blood glucose, but gets up there. And under the effect of body heat, the glucose in your tissue combines with the protein in the tissue and starts the same Maillard reaction. So every time your blood glucose spikes, every time someone with diabetes, their blood glucose spikes, someone with pre-diabetes when their glucose spikes, they're effectively toasting their brain, their kidneys, their eyes, their tissues, every single organ of the body. And that's just glucose under the effect of protein and body heat. That's simple biochemistry. And when our diets was 5% glucose, 5% carbohydrate, 1%, 10%, that situation occurred rarely. But now, if 50% of your diet is carbohydrate hitting the system every 2 hours, 4 hours, our blood glucoses are spiking. The pancreas is getting exhausted. That's what ultimately you get a thing called too high in insulin, hyperinsulinemia. The system's exhausted, so the glucose doesn't get stored away as quickly as it can, because our fat cells are full to the brim because of the amount of glucose and carbohydrate that's been pushed into them. So it spills over into the bloodstream, you get the Maillard reaction. So if you come back to where we are, if you eat carbohydrate and you eat it in excess, and certainly the more refined it is, you're going to have an acute effect in your liver with it being stored in fat. The muscles are going to get fat in them, but you're also going to get damage to the glycocalyx. You're going to get, this is short-term damage to the glycocalyx, short-term damage by that Maillard reaction, and the longer-term damage via the insulin effects, tumour, inflammation. That's just glucose. And the other side of the coin is fructose. So sugar is half glucose, half fructose. High fructose corn syrup and honey are about 55% fructose, 45% glucose. That figure varies a little bit. Fruits are different amounts of glucose and fructose, but they are just glucose and fructose. So someone says, fruit's natural sugar. No, it's still glucose, it's still fructose. They are the same biochemical pathways. So fructose, we didn't know a lot about that until about 2010, with pretty well definitive papers being written. So, and we're still learning about it. But nonetheless, fructose doesn't get not much absorption in the mouth, but it comes up the gut into the liver, and it's pretty well fully metabolized in the liver. Small amount in the gut, in the mesentery, the wall of the gut. Very small amount in the testes, but that's I think related to our fertility. Again, we don't need to eat that, but that's the only other spot where it's metabolized. So the body does everything in its capacity to stop the fructose getting into the bloodstream. It all happens in the liver. A small amount turned into glycogen, but bugger all because most is glucose. Fruit, we know you make wine from fruit, and it's the fructose component. And the liver does the same thing. There's a thing called an aldehyde pathway. Put fructose into the liver, fructose gets metabolized to aldehyde, which is an alcohol. And we end up with this. If you have too much fructose, then you end up with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. You end up with the same pathways that we see in alcoholic liver disease, cirrhosis. But we're now seeing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease as a normal finding on CAT scans of the abdomen, on MRIs of the abdomen. 8% of 10-year-olds have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and that's a paper from probably 7 or 8 years ago. So it can only be worse now. So we're seeing children with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And there have been a few papers now which say that if you take fructose out of the diet in teenagers, that liver change is restored to normal within weeks. So, it's a reversible situation. Liver has a great capacity to heal itself. So fructose has an aldehyde pathway. It has a uric acid pathway as a breakdown, and uric acid inhibits nitric oxide production. Nitric oxide is that one I talked about in the blood vessel walls, but nitric oxide is not only there to keep our blood vessels open and keep them working, it also has an effect on maintaining our circulation in the brain and also a function in our immune system for allowing the white cells to move into tissues which are damaged. So white cells have got to get to the point of repair, and they do that under the effect of nitric oxide. If you have too much fructose in your diet, you produce too much uric acid and you lose mobility of those white cells. It's called motility. And again, there have been some studies going back 30, 40 years looking at white cell motility under glucose loads and sugar loads. There's a great study done. It was a pilot study that effectively looked at if you eat carbohydrate, you in fact slow up your white cell function for around 72 hours. And if you fast, you improve white cell function. Now, as a surgeon, forever, we give, you go to after the hospital, you give people food after their anaesthetic. They've had an operation, they give them food. And most hospitals serve up bread, ice cream, biscuits, orange juice, that sort of thing. From a healing aspect, from a white cell function aspect, that glucose, carbohydrate, sugar load, which we give people within a couple of hours, is halving our healing ability for the next 72 hours. And what's the most critical time after an operation that you want everything to be working? It's the first few days, isn't it? But you want it to be working all the time. But what we're doing is we're giving people something which is slowing up their healing the moment they wake up after an anaesthetic. And that data's been around for decades. Yet, we choose to ignore it because it's much easier to give people, white bread and a bit of cake and a biscuit and a fruit juice. It's driven me insane, that, over a long period of time. Another thing that fructose does is it makes us hungry. When you eat fructose, it will make you hungry. And it does that by a couple of pathways. One is it stimulates ghrelin. And ghrelin is a hormone you feel in your stomach, which gives you the rumbly tummy. It's a hunger hormone. And fructose inhibits leptin. Now, leptin is a hormone produced by the fat in our bodies. And if you've got plenty of fat on board, it tells you you don't need to eat anymore. The fructose inhibits the leptin's effect back on the brain, the hypothalamus. And as a result of that, we have a double-edged sword. We've got something telling us, even though our body's telling us we've got plenty of fat on board, you don't need to eat anymore. The fructose is saying ignore that, and it will give you the ghrelin. Now, the proof of that in nature is that animals, when fruit comes into season, which is the only natural source of fructose, apart from honey and breast milk, but when fruit comes into season at the end of summer, beginning of winter, animals are driven crazy to eat as much as they possibly can so they get fat for winter storage, for winter hibernation. And it's the fructose component of it that does that. It's the fructose component that's telling the animal to eat this, gorge themselves so they get fat for winter. We also see that, I don't know if you've seen some of the videos of monkeys eating fruit on a tree when it comes into season, and the monkeys actually lie around drunk afterwards, totally lethargic, because of the alcohol effect. So what are the implications for us as humans in modern society? Well, if you eat sugar, eat fructose, you are going to be hungry all of the time. There's also going to be an alcohol pathway which is going to be making us lethargic, tired, less motivated. Have we noticed this in society? Yes, we've got fatter, sicker, lazier. And, we're coming up to Christmas now. Christmas is, the family get together, you have the big lunch, and half the family are asleep by in the mid-afternoon. And a little bit of it's the alcohol they've drunk, most of it's the food. Everyone's just lying around tired and lethargic. So again, the biochemistry is fructose. The observation is it's having that effect. Fructose continues to have effects. It actually increases insulin resistance in muscle, so it makes it harder for the glucose to be managed by the muscle as a fat storage. The other thing that fructose does is it ultimately, as a waste product, gets converted into small, dense, low-density lipoproteins. Now, the term lipoprotein is what's been loosely called good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. Lipoproteins are combinations of lipid, which is fat, and proteins to actually move them around the bloodstream. So fat in itself will just float in water. So fat by itself is not easily transportable in the bloodstream. Proteins are not easily absorbed into the bloodstream, so they combine in a combination called a lipoprotein to be transported around the bloodstream, so that you can take your protein from the liver and the fat, where that's the metabolism's done, and it's then transported into the tissues. And those lipoproteins end up being of all different shapes and sizes and densities. And so that's why we end up calling things good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. So a terrible term. There's a whole spectrum of lipoproteins. And the only way to really work out what's good and bad is to do a thing called a lipid subfraction analysis. Forget your standard cholesterol test, the standard profile that's done. The only thing that's decent in that is a triglyceride level, because the triglycerides are an indirect measurement of the small dense LDLs. So most people, I only know the numbers here for Australia, you're told your triglycerides are good if they're less than 2. But if they're less than 0.7, which is where mine's 0.6, not bragging, it's just what it is, 0.7 means you have no small dense LDL particles floating around the bloodstream. So it's the poor man's test of that on a standard lipid profile. If it's higher than that, then you do have them. So what happens with the small dense LDLs? They're the ones which actually float around the bloodstream, and I call them they're a Goldilocks particle, because they can get into the blood. They're just the right size and shape to get into our blood vessel walls. So they don't just go through the blood, they go through the blood vessel walls and they get stuck there. Now, in an old society going back 100 years, you can eat your sugar, you can eat your carbohydrates, and you will produce small dense LDLs. The problem's been that remember I call that lipoproteins. The proteins haven't changed much over time, but the lipid, the fats have. So 100 years ago, the omega-6 component of the fat was about 1%. The omega-6 component of the fat in our bodies is now about 25 to 30%. So people have heard of omega-3s and omega-6s and omega-9s. As it turns out, we do need very small amounts of those, but the amount, once you get past that limit, then they become inflammatory. And they become inflammatory because they can become oxidized. And if 30% of the fat in our fat is now omega-6, it becomes oxidized, and that becomes highly inflammatory. So we've got these small, dense LDL particles being produced by fructose. They then get into our organs, into the blood vessel walls, are oxidized there. It becomes a whole inflammatory mess. Do you want me to go back to saturated fat versus polyunsaturated?
Let's go there, but first I want to make a connection with something you brought up earlier. The glucose in our system, when it hits a certain threshold, having that leaky, damaging impact on the glycocalyx. So I'm trying to tie this into the part of the story you're at now with the small dense LDL from fructose. I would have to imagine that glucose-fructose combination together with the damage to the glycocalyx would enhance the issues of the small dense LDL.
Yes. I use the term, it's a perfect storm. We've compounded one upon the other. We've upped the glucose, we've upped the damage, we upped the fructose, we upped the particles which are causing more damage, and then we add in the seed oils, which are inflammatory. Bang, we've got the perfect storm. We've got a description of modern disease. We've also got the fact that 40% of glucose is converted to fructose by a thing called the polyol pathway. And that to me was the runaway train moment. We can put everything together, but if we actually then create so much glucose load on the system and finding out that 40% of it's turned into fructose, which is even more small dense LDLs, which is more particles which are ready to get oxidized. Bang, it's not everything. I think there are other chemicals in our food system. I think there are other toxins in our food system. I think we've got other issues in our bodies, not enough sleep, not enough light, or the wrong light. I find all that light thing, all of those are other contributing factors. But at the core of it, what fuel you put in your car determines how the car's going to run. You can put as much paint and polish and clean it and vacuum it and all that sort of thing, has an effect on your car. But it's the fuel that's the primary issue. And so I think that's where the modern diet, the conventional modern diet, is, I think, toxic, inflammatory, progressive, but also able to be remediated. So you can just do the opposite of that and reduce the sugar, the carbs, and the seed oils and see what happens. And so many people following you, me, others have done that and gone low carb or gone keto or gone carnivore, because that is the opposite of eating an ultra-processed conventional diet. And then you see what happens to yourself by literally just reducing this inflammatory load. It's so damn obvious. If someone's hitting you with a bat, in the face, just walk away from it. If you're driving up the highway and there's all this traffic coming at you, turn around, do the opposite. And the biochemistry is simple. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. If an orthopedic surgeon can understand this biochemistry, what about all the other clever doctors out there? We're just the carpenters of life. But but one of the things about orthopedics is it is about, here's a problem, how do we fix it? And that's all I've done, is we've just gone back to what is the root cause. Well, the root cause is we're putting the wrong fuel in the car. Let's put the right fuel in the body and then see what benefits. And it changed my clinical practice so much. Just by people changing their diet meant I ended up operating a lot less. But people took control of their lives, they were empowered, and they improved their health, and they didn't need an operation. Or maybe they needed a knee replacement. We put it off for 6 months. We put it off for a year. We put it off for 2. And I can guarantee you it's much easier to recover from a knee replacement when you've lost 5 or 10 kilograms than if you're carrying an extra 5 or 10 kilograms. Just back to oils and fats, because they're the same thing. An oil and a fat is the same thing. They're combinations of saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fats. And the term fat and oil is determined by how it looks at room temperature. So butter at room temperature is a solid. Canola oil at room temperature is a liquid. And it's really a combination. It's really determined by how much saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat there is in it. So if you get a fat and it's saturated, it means it has no double bonds in it. And it's quite solid. And so it will stay solid at room temperature. But at body temperature, which is what our 37 degrees, that will in fact be liquid. It'll be fluid. It's mobile. And you've only got to put butter out in the sun and you'll see it all melt. It just goes cool. If you put butter in the fridge, it goes rock solid. If you put one double bond into it, that becomes monounsaturated. It's just got one double bond, and that creates a little bit of flexibility. If you put multiple double bonds into it, it becomes polyunsaturated. So multiple double bonds creates more flexibility, that's why polyunsaturated oil is liquid at room temperature. Now, saturated fats tend to be mostly coming from animal-based. Polyunsaturated fats tend to be coming from plants. Plants need to have all that flexibility and a liquid oil at cold temperatures because where you are, you get snow, I presume, at some point.
Yeah.
So if the plant had saturated fats in it, then the plant will die. It will just freeze up completely. So it needs liquidity. It needs liquidity at very low temperatures. So that comes from being polyunsaturated. Now, there's no food that is 100% saturated fat or 100% polyunsaturated. They've all got little combinations of it. Even butter's got a bit of polyunsaturated oil in it. So the poly then becomes, you've got omega-3s, omega-6s, omega-9s, omega-12s. It goes on. And that refers to the number of double bonds that are in that chain of fatty acids to make up the oil. Now, the flexibility of that oil, the flexibility of that fatty chain comes at a price because each one of those double bonds becomes a point of weakness which can become oxidized. And the analogy is like a bit of metal that can rust. So when the seed oil becomes oxidized, that becomes rancid. So butter doesn't tend to go rancid because it doesn't have much in the way of double bonds in it. A seed oil, under the effect of oxygen, will become rancid. Now we've seen all this stuff that happens in our refrigerator if you leave the stuff on the bench. It goes, exactly the same process happens when we eat it. So the amount of fats and the distribution of fat, whether or not it's saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, that's in our body is a direct reflection of what we eat. So as I say, 100 years ago, it was estimated that the amount of omega-6, 6 double bonds in our body, was about 1%. And it's now been measured to be 25 to 30% in a linear way. And Stefan Guillenet put that stuff together 10 years ago now. Found a whole lot of articles starting in the 1950s where they started measuring the amount of linoleic acid in the fat. And again, that's an association evidence, but it makes sense. And what was interesting from other data, the amount of linoleic acid in breast milk of US women, United States women, was much, much, much higher than that in African women. So my take on all of that, and again, that in itself may be a little bit controversial, is that if we're actually making our babies at an embryonic level, 2 cells, 4 cells, 8, 16, and then going up from there, and we're starting with our building blocks being made up of oxidizable or oxidized fat, 30% of them, then we're creating our babies out of inflammatory material. Because remember the old story of the 3 little pigs? If you've got a choice of building your house out of bricks or out of wood or out of twigs, that's what we're now making our babies for the last 50 years out of inflammatory polyunsaturated fats. which can become oxidized. We're combining it with high sugar and carbohydrate loads, and that creates inflammation, by my reckoning, in every single blood vessel, in every single corner of the body, every single cell membrane, every single mitochondrial membrane, remembering they're the engines of the cells, where all of this energy of food gets turned into energy. Every single corner of our bodies is now made up of inflammatory material. Is it any wonder that all disease is based on inflammation? Is it any wonder we've got out-of-control cancer, mental health, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, learning issues? Children's cancer rates are going up at around about 3% per annum over the last 40 years. Every year. An extra 3%, off a low base, but nonetheless it's going up. Cancer rates are going up. We can add in all sorts of other things, whether or not it's chemicals or, again, things we talked about in the food cycle. But to me, the base first step is it's our food. And it's the one thing you can take control over today.
And when it comes to the seed oil piece, there is good and bad news there. The good news is over time, we can change up the food we're taking in, the fats and oils we're taking in, make better choices, and do sort of an oil change on our body over time. Bad news is it takes years. And that's not even, you just put up 4 fingers. That's not even the whole story. That's one half-life.
Yeah.
Talk more about that.
I think, well, it's really hard to drag out that data. I've just got to, it'll come to me back. There's a fellow in New York who's a professor of oils. I think he's retired now. He's written a book. Glenn, he'll come to me. Anyway, he wrote a piece about this, and then I wrote to him about it saying, what is the half-life of an omega-6 linoleic acid in the body? And he said, I'll read my book. So I read his book from cover to cover. Then I emailed him back saying, look, I've read your book from cover to cover. It's really interesting. We talk about all this inflammation or whatever, but you didn't answer my question of what is the half-life. And he says, very good question, Gary. We don't know. But it's probably in the vicinity of 4 years to get rid of those fats. It's got a slow turnover. So to get rid of fat, to reduce the amount of inflammation, the amount of oxidizable omega-6s in particular, is probably going to take at least 4 years. Now, anecdotally, if you listen to people, and again, listen to people who have got neurodegenerative problems, inflammation problems, autoimmune problems, they'll say that they do a low-carb ketogenic carnivore diet and they feel better. But if you really listen to them, and it's one of the few times I have listened to my sister and sisters-in-law, they say, one of my sister-in-laws, she was diagnosed with MS, multiple sclerosis. It was not quite right, but nonetheless, that was the diagnosis she was given. And she reluctantly agreed to try what I've been talking about and yapping about, because sisters never believe brothers. Have you got any sisters?
No, brother.
Yeah. Well, most siblings don't believe the other sibling, okay? Anyway, but she reluctantly did it. And then she came back to me and she said, 4 years down the track, she said, I've come off all my medication. Everything's better. Now, that's not just a one-off story. It's a multiple stories like that. I can't remember if I told you last time about she was our teenage daughter at that time. We got off the plane traveling and she had a craving for McDonald's chips. And she's 16, tall, long, leggy, blonde. And she said, Dad, can I have some McDonald's chips? And she knew that I was very carbs, processed food, seed oils. And she looked me in the eye and she said, look, Dad, let me have them, please. I promise not to get pregnant for 4 years. Now, that is a perfect informed consent. She made a decision to poison her body but she knew the repercussions of it were going to be there for 4 years, and she promised not to get pregnant. Now, you tell me any father who's not going to fork out $3 or whatever it is to have his 16-year-old daughter promise him that she's not going to get pregnant for 4 years. So she didn't, by the way, get pregnant. She's 29 now, but nonetheless. And that's an informed decision. And I quite like informed consent. Like if, as a surgeon, you give informed consent to patients before they have an operation. If you smoke nowadays, you've made a pretty well informed decision to be an idiot. The amount of information we have about tobacco causing harm and people still smoking, they know that it's bad for them, but they've done that. So it's an informed decision to smoke / to be an idiot. What I would like us to see, and maybe it will or won't happen in my lifetime, I'd like to see that if you decide to eat ultra-processed food, which is high in sugar and carbohydrates and seed oils, that you're making an informed decision to eat that, knowing that it's not good for you. That's a big step. Some years ago, people said, "What's your end game?" And our end game with diabetes has been achieved. And so, therefore, if you have type 2 diabetes, you should be informed that it is reversible by therapeutic carbohydrate reduction. That's the official term. And that you should be supported to do that. Now, it's not happening everywhere in the world, but here in Australia in the last couple of years, with an enormous amount of work, therapeutic carbohydrate reduction, low carb, is now in the National Diabetes Guidelines. It's been adopted as best practice guidelines by the Australian Diabetes Society, which is all endocrinologists, and by Diabetes Australia. So we have it now in the guidelines. So if you recommend this to people, you are no longer dangerous. This is based on good science. It's been adopted by the peak bodies to say this is it. So here in Australia, I've achieved an outcome that we want. For me, we've gotten to that point. There are other countries around the world, and I was speaking to a Nordic doctor, I won't mention which country because I don't want to, earlier this week, who's trying to do the same thing in this country, adopt a guideline which is now internationally referenced, but she's come up against all the same barriers that we have for the last 15 years. So low carb has got a clear scientific role in the management of diabetes. And if you've got diabetes and you want to eat sugar and ice cream, you're going to be making an informed decision to be an idiot. Can we now move that on to the rest of society to say, if you want to keep eating ultra-processed food, you're going to be making an informed decision for your poor health? And I think you've heard me say before, and I've said it, I'll keep saying it, if you eat by the food pyramid, you're going to die by the food pyramid, and along the way you're going to look like it. That's it in a nutshell. That food pyramid is not based on science, it's based on beliefs, it's based on food industry profitability and all those cereals and grains at the bottom. The My Plate that's out of the US guidelines doesn't even have meat on it anymore. It's just got protein, and it's still high, laden in carbohydrates when you break it all down. So if you eat by dietary guidelines, I'd like people to start saying, don't trust the government. How many examples have we had of that in the last, I'll just say few years and leave it at that. Because the people who get involved in writing these guidelines, whether or not they're medical guidelines, the food guidelines, are pretty well supported or compromised by their industries. And so you don't have to scratch the surface very hard to find out that virtually everyone on these guideline committees has a tie to the food industry or the pharmaceutical industry. And so what do you think they come out with? They don't come out with something that says that's bad for their industry, do they? And we have continued to swallow this information in the belief that our government has our best interests. And no. And I haven't gone down any conspiracy theories there. It's not a conspiracy if it turns out to be a fact. It's just every day you read something which goes, I was talking about that 10 years ago. Now it's coming to fruition.
Before we fully close the door on the seed oil piece, let's make sure we're really clear with people what oil specifically we're talking about there.
Well, if it's in a bottle, it's a good start.
Okay, well, this leads to my next question. Things like olive oil, coconut oil, avocado oil, ones that are, depending on what camp you're in, looked at as healthy oils.
Hey, it's a great thing, marketing, isn't it? So if it's an oil, then it is liquid at room temperature, and it's going to have higher components of polyunsaturated and monounsaturated oil in it, and smaller components of saturated fat. Even butter has got a bit of monounsaturated and polyunsaturated in it, but it's more solid at room temperature. So if it's liquid at room temperature, and I think the classic grey area here is olive oil. Okay, I think the sunflower oils, the canola oils, anything that's got vegetable oil written on it, just don't even touch it. But tell me how you get oil out of a vegetable. I mean, that's just marketing. It's just got. It's best. There is a good use for vegetable oil, by the way. Okay, if you mix vegetable oil with detergent, a liquid detergent, then you can spray it on your plants to keep insects out. And that's called white oil. That's actually made from seed oils. And what it does is you spray it on the plants to kill the insects, right? To kill the insects. So polyunsaturated oil kills insects. So why on earth do you want to put it in your body? So that is a role for canola oils and stuff like that. And I have a bottle of vegetable oil, but it was only used to spray the plants in a green fashion. But now we don't virtually grow any plants to eat, and mostly carnivore. We just don't have the white oil. So olive oil in itself is interesting. And I'm not the first person to say this, but olive oil, I think, is not quite as good for us as it's been touted to be. If you break it down, it has higher amounts of, we're told monounsaturated oils are good for us. Well, yes, they're better for us than the polyunsaturated, but they still have double bonds in them. And those double bonds can become oxidized. And you've got to work out where that marketing came from, because it's part of our tradition. Olive oil, Mediterranean diet. Olive oil, Mediterranean, it's the healthiest diet. Well, two things about the Mediterranean diet. Here's a little trivial pursuit question for you. How many countries border the Mediterranean?
Couldn't tell you, I'll guess 6.
22.
Way off.
If we take what's the traditional diet of Morocco versus Egypt versus France versus Italy versus Greece versus Libya, okay, look, bang, okay, they're all completely different diets, but it's the Mediterranean diet. So when you realise that the Mediterranean diet is never been defined, number one. Number two, it is loosely based around a Greek coastal diet. And if you take all of the benefits of a Mediterranean diet, they are eating pretty well fresh, local, seasonal, whole produce based on their culture and environment, which is, one of my mainstay comments. That's what we should eat, with avoiding added sugar and processed food. Now, that's a Mediterranean diet, because it doesn't matter where you are, but it's not a diet which is plant-based. It is about eating natural foods and high amounts of natural fats from animal-based products, fish, and their pigs, their goats, their sheep, occasionally cattle. So there are benefits of the Mediterranean diet, because that is fresh, local, seasonal, whole food. It's not vegan, vegetarian, nuts, fruits, grain. It is not. So in the 1960s and 70s, the olive oil industry, based primarily around Greece and Italy, decided to have conferences where they invited speakers from around the world and journalists to come to the conferences about olive oil and the benefits of a Mediterranean diet. And if you were a journalist and you wrote favourably about it, you were invited back to the Greek islands the following year for a freebie trip. And the following year, if you continue to write favourably in the media about the benefits of olive oil and the Mediterranean diet, you got invited back again. Have you been to the Greek islands?
I haven't. You?
They are lovely, okay? They're very special, and would I write favourably and sell my soul to go back to the Greek islands next year? Not me, but enough people did in the 1970s to create the myth of the benefits of the Mediterranean diet and olive oil. And hence it is now entrenched in our system. If you look up the black market related to olive oil and the difference between virgin and extra virgin olive oils and whatever, and the tampering, olive oil in one place is not the same as olive oil in another place. The amount of seed oils, the amount of vegetable oils that have been creeping into the olive oil industry just to dilute it down, to actually, because olive oil requires a lot more industry, a lot more effort to take olives, crush them, mill them, ferment them. I know there's not much fermenting, but nonetheless to process them. But if you can actually put a bit of vegetable oils in there which are industrially determined, you can actually water down, or not water, oil them down. So the bastardization of the olive oil industry is a whole topic in itself, and you can people get on the internet and go searching down that rabbit hole. So olive oil is touted to be really beneficial for us. But it all comes down to nutrition science. It's really, really vague. I talked a lot about biochemistry before, but nutrition science is, I ate this 25 years ago and therefore this is the cause, this is why I'm healthy now. Or I ate that 25 years ago and I'm unhealthy now. That's, I can ask you what you ate for lunch 6 months ago and you won't be able to remember. The food questionnaires that have been used in these studies are just notoriously wrong. People, when they report their food, report eating what they think is better for it. They over-report what they think is good. They under-report what's bad. Most of those studies leave out smoking. They leave out lifestyle. They leave out exercise. They leave out community and all those other things which play a role in our health and well-being. Nutritional studies over a long period of time are notoriously bad unless you start controlling things very, very vigorously, which makes for small studies very expensive and pretty well having to lock people up. And so there have been some interesting nutritional studies done on prisoners, which is really interesting because if I look at our current inmates, most of them are getting fatter and sicker. And there have been some reported cases out of the US where the inmates have sued their detention bodies for developing diabetes. I think it's brilliant because they say, I can't get healthy food and now I've got diabetes, and they become legal cases. And guess what? The prisoners are right, because the food that's served in prison is determined by the food guidelines. Food guidelines determine what's educated to our children in schools, what's served in hospitals, what's served in nursing homes, what's served in prisons, what's served in defence forces. And you look at, again, because the US published this data, look at the obesity rates in the US military, in the Australian military. They're just out of control. And again, something I've seen it, can't quote it directly. Again, some people can fact check me. I'm very happy on it. That the majority of of young people are not fit to actually serve in the military because they're too overweight. It's not surprising because you walk down the street and you can make that judgment without being too judgmental. It's an observation. I just shake my head. Yeah, we're totally screwed, Jess. It's propaganda. It's what we've been told for generations now because of the manipulation of information by the food industry into our guidelines. That's it, and that's pretty well. And we covered a lot of that in the last talk about our guidelines have been manipulated by the processed food industry for over 100 years. I've got one thing to add. Last time we talked about the formation of the American Dietetics Association, October 22, 23, 1917. Started from proteges of John Harvey Kellogg and co, and the textbooks are all vegan, vegetarian, processed food. What's really interesting, at that meeting, with around 4 to 6 weeks' notice, there were 9 food industry corporate sponsors at the very first meeting of the American Dietetics Association. And in their letter back to the newly formed members, they showed that they had made a profit, $100 US. But $100 US 1917 was a big sum. Now, I don't know if you've ever put on a conference. We have. You don't make any money. And if you give everyone 4 weeks' notice and you don't charge them to be there, you don't make a profit. The American Dietetics Association was the members who started that not only came from the food industry and shaped our guidelines, they were backed by the food industry before they even started. We can track, particularly Belinda's work, we can track 100 years of this story. Well, it's more than that now, but it's just over and over and over. We've been manipulated. Our education's been manipulated. We've been told to do the wrong thing. And yes, you can use carbohydrates as energy at a cellular level, but the amount of carbohydrate that we're ingesting has got all sorts of biochemical, pathological problems with it. And the amount, and then we've added into it the seed oils, the vegetable oils, which are polyunsaturated and highly inflammatory once they become oxidized. And I just keep saying it's a perfect storm. And the more trouble I got into 10, 15 years ago, the more I knew I was right. I mean, that's the great thing about being an orthopedic surgeon. We're born and bred to be arrogant. And there's actually something in that because, you have to back yourself to do surgery. You can't be double guessing yourself. You can't be double thinking. You can't be, the more you actually worry about things, the less likely things get done. So orthopedic surgeons on the whole back themselves. Okay, I can do this procedure with the equipment available to me. I'm skilled enough to do it. And the same thing goes with this nutrition stuff. The more I've looked into it, the more my medical education, that I was a product of misinformation and disinformation right across the board. So have I become cynical? No, I am cynical. And because everything you look into here, the vast majority of my medical education was manipulated. Am I 100% right on all of this? No, but I'm a hell of a lot more right than wrong. And I'm still learning. No, you're still learning. I mean, if at the moment you stop learning, then that's it. So that was the recent thing Belinda uncovered was about the fact that 9 food industry groups were there at the formation of the American Dietetics Association.
You can't make this up.
Oh, I did hear. What's the difference between fact and fiction?
I don't know. What is it?
Well, fiction's plausible. You got to think it through, don't you?
I got you.
You go, oh, yeah, okay, because people say it's fact is stranger than fiction, but that's it, because if you're going to write a story and make something up, it's got to have plausibility. But if I just tell you facts and you go, oh my goodness, how did that, okay, that's what happened. Because, there's enormous amounts of money, monopoly, ideology, all stuff floating along behind it. And when you are driven by money and ideology and philosophy, and that's the fascinating thing, that, and we as a society like to believe what we've been told. We've all fallen for it. It's one of the greatest cons of all time. This is Cassandra's curse, which is one of my favourite things at the moment. Have you heard of Cassandra?
No, tell me about it.
So Cassandra, you've heard of Helen of Troy, the Trojan horse?
Yes.
All right. Well, Helen, her love was a fellow by the name of Paris, and he went to war for decades, and that's the whole story of the Trojan horse. Anyway, Paris's sister was called Cassandra. Greek mythology all gets a little bit mixed up here, but anyway, the god Apollo fell in love with Cassandra, and he favoured her with his affection, and he gave her the ability to see into the future. But then she didn't receive his affections, so she said, no, thank you. So he then cursed her with the ability to see into the future, but nobody would believe her. So the curse was that she could see what was going to happen, but nobody would believe her. So the more I look at things, I've actually got Cassandra's curse. I've been talking about this for a long time, and it all comes down to the C's. It's carbohydrate, cholesterol,
calories.
Yeah, calories. Then I start talking about currencies, cryptocurrencies, COVID. Climate change, CO2, conspiracies. So everything starts with a C. A good friend of mine's Ivor Cummins. Do you know Ivor?
I know of him, yes.
Yeah. So I wrote to Ivor. I said, hey, mate, we've both got Cassandra's curse, but you've got an advantage over me because your surname starts with C. And we had a bit of a laugh about it. And controversy. There's another. It's just the more you look into it. Yes, all this stuff is controversial. I get it. But as I've quoted, I wrote a book many years ago, but only dead fish swim with the current. You're truly alive when you're questioning and you're turning around. You've got an email from me. You're going to get them from me. And on the bottom it says, science evolves by being challenged, not by being followed. That's the scientific method. That is evolution. Evolution means we've challenged what's going on to try and find something better. And the moment we accept that everything's normal and that's the way it is and it's the best it can ever be, then you're dead. And so the same thing goes. If we're looking at society and we're getting fatter and sicker, and the guidelines are telling us what to do for the last 50 years, 100 years, well, maybe the guidelines are wrong. And they should be challenged. And if you don't see something, if it doesn't make sense, challenge it. Sure, it requires some bravery and support and all that sort of thing. And everyone's got different levels of confidence at different times and times in their lives. And if you actually feel it doesn't make sense, question it. Try and do independent research. Don't listen to what the government's telling you. Don't listen to mainstream media. Delve back into it. And delve back into the biochemistry, because the biochemistry is science. All this nutrition stuff. What happens inside a cell is science. What happens outside the body is politics, religion, ideology, money. Inside, and so that's all I keep coming back to. This is the science. The biochemistry doesn't change, hasn't changed for hundreds of thousands of years. Not since we're living creatures. It's our biochemistry is based on what happens at mitochondrial function. That's it. And we've screwed it up with a modern diet.
I know you got to go here soon, but a couple things I want to tie loose end-wise before we part ways. I asked you initially there about olive oil, coconut oil, avocado oil. You made some good points talking about the oils being corrupt and diluted with other oils, and the quality of the science being not so great. But point blank, are you using not avocado, but are you using olive oil? And then do you think that is something that's acceptable for somebody trying to live a healthy lifestyle?
I'll just come back one step. Coconut oil is solid. It comes in a jar. You've got to heat it up to get it out of the jar. So, I mean, coconut oil, and that's 99% saturated fat and about 1% mono and poly. So it's funny how it's called coconut oil when it's not. It's coconut butter. It's coconut fat. It's solid. So if you've got coconut oil that you can pour out of a bottle where you are, it ain't coconut oil, okay?
Depends on the time of the year. You can almost use it like a thermometer here.
Yeah, okay. If it's really hot, then you can. Okay, I'll get that. But most times, where I am, it comes in a jar. If I'm a purist, so we don't have olive oil in the house. Actually, we do have some, but if you're actually cooking animal-based foods there's enough fat in them to actually, you don't need to put extra fat in. Why have we got olive oil in the house? I don't know. I know there's a bottle there. I think it was given to us. Yeah, it was given to us. I don't think we purchased it. But I'm a bit of a purist. So as a purist, you sort of, I'm at one end of the spectrum. Okay, I'm doing it hardcore. I'm doing it for my own personal reasons, my health journey, my lifestyle, whatever. At the other end of the spectrum is where people are eating crap food all of the time, getting fatter and sicker and unhealthy, and society's mostly over that side. Now, if 90% of the population do 90% of what I'm talking about, we're going to see an enormous turnaround in health. And we might see people fall off the bandwagon from time to time. So if you've got a choice between having olive oil and vegetable oil or canola oil, then have the olive oil. It is going to be better for you. But just remember, it's still got it's got oxidizable double bonds in it, which can potentially cause some inflammation. It's about the sugar thing. I think we talked about this in the last talk where, yes, in season, I will have a few berries in a granola mix at night because I know that the few berries are going to contain a little bit of fructose and it's going to make me hungry. So I'm eating knowing what it's going to do. I've made an informed decision to be an idiot. I'm having some fruit because I like the sweetness. But bearing in mind, sweetness is actually something which is part of our survival mechanism as animals to get fat for winter hibernation. So, okay, I fall for that addiction. Yeah, I probably have less than 20 berries per year, okay? So I can't say that it's an extreme, people might say that's extreme. But I do have them, but I understand that if I eat them, and if I eat them at breakfast, then I'm going to be hungrier in 2 and 3 and 4 hours' time. So I have them at night. So the same thing goes with olive oil. I'd rather you have olive oil than a vegetable oil. But I think for everyone, there's a journey. There's a journey that they want to go on, and they travel down this path, and they may end up. And I've talked about this in some of my presentations. The journey, you go from eating the crap diet, the standard diet, then you actually move to the food pyramid, still find out that it makes you sick. And then you go to moving to low-carb, healthy fat, and then you move to keto, and then you move to carnivore, all for different reasons. And there is a group who travel the path of vegan because it seems to be more pure food, less processed. And they do well for a couple of years until they realise they're actually missing out on the essential vitamins, minerals, proteins and fats, and they move towards LCHF. And there's a lot of high-profile speakers in the world who used to be vegan, but they've gone to actually realising the critical role of animal-based foods. So everyone's at a different point in their journey. Some people are still eating badly and are well. There are some people who are eating badly who are getting unwell and then start to transition down that pathway. And some people need to go all the way to take all the plant-based materials out of their diet so they get rid of the oxalates and the phytates and the other toxins that are within plants to get to their health point. But if you start moving down this pathway, then you start learning more and more. You learn more about what's good and bad outside of mainstream eating, and you learn what's good and bad for you. And we've got a technology-driven society. You can get hold of, directly or indirectly, what's called CGMs, continuous glucose monitors, normally got one on my desk here somewhere. And you can put that underneath, you stick it on your skin, and it will measure your glucose levels. That is perfect individualized healthcare. You can see exactly what food does to you. So when I put one on, mine stays perfectly flat. My blood glucose does not go up or down. But I have, in the midst of a lecture, worn that, and I ate 2 bananas at the beginning of the lecture, and I watched everyone could watch my blood glucose go up and up and up. Within about 40 minutes, I was in the diabetic range. I'd lost my voice. I could barely talk. I came off the stage, and my daughter said, "Are you okay, Dad?" I said, "No, I'm feeling really sick as a dog." And then it came back down again. But we've also done that on live radio. Here's an example with radio announcer, big guy, put a glucose monitor on him, and he ate the 9-grain super healthy bread, and his blood glucose went up through the roof. And he was actually on air saying, "I'm feeling sick." We didn't name the brand of it. It was discussed. And it was part of an ongoing educational thing. Within 2 hours, the bread companies were on the phone to the radio station saying, "We're going to withdraw all our advertising unless you take that program down." Because the public don't want to know that your blood glucose spikes when you have a couple of slices of bread. So CGMs are very powerful. So if you can get hold of one and you're on this journey and you want to see what food does to you, don't believe me, don't believe you, don't believe anything that you hear. Stick a glucose monitor on and monitor it for yourself and see what happens to your blood glucose. And if you can eat cake and bread and rice and pasta and pizza and your blood glucose stays perfectly normal, you might be the freak that gets away with it. But if you're like most people I know who put a CGM on, they find it an incredible learning experience to think what they thought was eating healthy was in fact spiking their blood glucose all over the place. And when you spike your blood glucose, you damage the glycocalyx, your Maillard reaction kicks in. You are toasting your brain, your kidneys, your eyes. It's just an incredible wake-up call with going on this health journey. And that's just another tool along the way. There's another long-winded fettke answer. Sorry.
No, I love it. Did they end up taking the radio show down?
No, they took down that live clip that was on Facebook, though. And he didn't talk about it. I'm allowed to talk about him a bit because I actually, in our last state elections here, I put glucose monitors on both sides of politics. And between both sides of politics, they lost over 50 kilograms, they and their teams. And I then said, okay, if it's good enough for you, it's now what about the people? So I did go down to Parliament House and have lunch there, talking to the health minister and both sides of politics in a bipartisan sort of approach to, okay, what can we do for the people? But being good politicians, they said, okay, yes, Dr. Fettke, and nothing much has happened. But we keep trying. So a glucose monitor is a very powerful tool for proving to people what food does to them. But you can listen to your body. You can say, oh, I've eaten too much sugar and carbs and I'll have too much Christmas lunch and too much Christmas pudding. I'm going to feel tired and lethargic. Or you have your bacon and eggs for breakfast and then you go actually out and exercise all day and you feel good. Just start listening to our bodies. That's what it's about.
All right, we got to round out the PUFA conversation. So far, we've been talking about seed oils, PUFA's under there, linoleic acid. But the other half of that equation is the omega-3s. And people saying, eat your fish, people guzzling down fish oil. Those omega-3s are PUFAs as well, which are fragile. So how do you fit that into what you've shared?
Omega-3 is an essential. Again, if you eat the modern diet, it's depleted in omega-3, but it's too much omega-6. So we do need some omega-3. So a lot of people actually don't have enough omega-3 in their diet. So having some fish, having some fish oil comes with its calories, is omega-3. And yes, so we all require some omega-3 and omega-6. And if you eat a standard crap diet, you're not getting any omega-3, you're getting a truckload of omega-6. So to get your omega-3 levels up, we could eat a lot more junk food, but we'll pay the price with getting an enormous amount of omega-6. Or you can actually eat the fish or take an omega-3 supplement, which will bump up your omega-3s but not change your omega-6. So what's the old adage? The dose is the poison. We do need some omega-3. We do need omega-6. We just don't need 100 times more than we get, because the body has to do something with it. It just sticks it in a corner and then becomes oxidized. And again, the omega-3 is a bit like the monounsaturated argument. We do need some, but we don't need a lot. Now, I know that's a wishy-washy answer, but Glenn Lawrence, how I worked it out, I remembered by the end of it. If you've got a problem with everything I talk about, contact Glenn Lawrence in New York, okay? He's written a definitive book about it. And the interesting thing, all of this, is we don't know all of the answers. I'm just trying to give you a summation of the knowledge that I've been able to put together about the omega-3s, the omega-6s. There are other people who feel vehemently that it's all one or the other, and that the omega-6s are all of the problem and the omega-3s are part of the problem. There are other people that say that they're not the problem at all. It makes sense to me, from my understanding of biochemistry and looking at all of this stuff over a long period of time now, over a couple of decades, that it's the combination. So do I have a definitive answer? Yeah, I'd rather you eat fish than fish fingers, okay? I'd rather, because it's going to be a whole fish. It falls under what my overall guideline for eating. Eat fresh, local, seasonal, whole food based on your culture and environment, avoiding added sugar and processed food. That's my mantra. That's the evolutionary diet. And if you can avoid taking a supplement, don't take it.
Last piece I'll add to this too is that with certain animals, the monogastric, like chickens and pigs, they're going to have a higher level of linoleic acid in their fat they are consuming if they're being fed grains, versus a cow where there's less of that happening, even if the cow is being finished on grains. So I just think there's an important piece to round out this whole omega-3, omega-6 part of the conversation, that even within animal foods, people that are wanting to be, healthy and cognizant and making good choices, within certain animals, it matters more than others what that animal is eating.
I looked into this probably 10 years ago because I think it's a great question, a great thing to look at. If you look at the omega-3, omega-6 ratios of pasture-fed animals versus factory-farmed, grain-fed animals, and it doesn't matter if you're chicken, pigs, cattle, the omega-3, omega-6 ratios are much better in the pasture-fed, the natural-born, the organic. However, if you've got a choice, if you have the luxury of choice, then eat the pasture-fed. But if you don't have the ability, the luxury of choice, and you have a choice between a factory-farmed fish meat product, it is still much, much better than buying processed food. Like a whole step away. So I'm fortunate. I have the luxury to live in a place where I can get pasture-fed produce. But there are whole places in the world that don't. But those animal-based products are still going to be better than the ultra-processed ones. And so they go up by a couple of percent, but they don't go up by dramatically. So don't get too worried if you're eating, from a health aspect, factory farmed animals. We can travel all the paths of philosophy, and I'm not condoning factory farming of any animal, but from the omega-3, omega-6 it's actually not quite as good as pasture-fed, certainly not bad, and infinitely better than eating ultra-processed food.
I think we both agree. Yes, any animal product is going to be better than processed food. I mean, there can be processed animal food too, but we'll take that out of the equation. We have to consider ethics. Obviously, both of us would agree that we want our animals treated the best that they can be treated. But I'm not talking about omega-3s. I'd have to look into that piece. I'm only commenting on linoleic acid in the monogastric animals like chickens and pigs, where I think that number, and I'm making the numbers up, but this is going to represent what I'm talking about. The linoleic acid may be 2-3% in those specific animals when they're being fed a natural diet versus feeding them grains where that can jump up to 20+%. And then in cows, the fluctuation isn't the same due to their digestion. So that was the point I was trying to hammer home there. But then there's the omega-3, omega-6 balance, and that's not something I'm familiar with to comment on that.
Again, that's my summation of the information that I've come across. And ultimately, in the passage of time, I'll maybe proven wrong on that, because we actually just don't understand the biochemistry of fat as well as we understand the biochemistry of carbohydrates and protein. Just hasn't been studied as much. And as I say, Glenn Lawrence has written a definitive book on it, and it's incomplete by his own admission, because we just don't have all the answers there. So let's keep learning, because we haven't got all the answers yet.
Yeah, we definitely don't have all the answers either, but we're trying to look at the information, bring it to light for other people, and in the process make critical decisions for us and our family, and being critical thinkers best we can in that process.
Good philosophy.
Gary, really enjoyed round 2. Thank you. We're going to link up your website, your social media, link up some of your talks in the show notes. Thank you.
I'm just really interested if we do a session 3, because last time you were clean shaven, you got the moustache this time, and I reckon next time it'll be the beard, okay?
Maybe you can grow one too.
I did that. Belinda told me not to shave for a year or 2. And then one day she just looked at me and I said, I'm shaving today, aren't I? She said, yes, you are. Yeah.
Maybe for round 3, we'll convince Belinda to let you grow a little beard, and I can grow one too for fun.
I don't think so. It was pretty pathetic, sort of a goatee, sort of professorial sort of look for a little while.
Well, mine's not much of a beard either, so I can relate. Gary, thank you again.
All right, mate. Keep well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
Once you understand where the non-science is coming from, where the propaganda is coming from, and it is industry, pharmaceutical, and religious ideology, now I understand why I was conned in my medical